Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Today we are delighted to have with us Charles Ogunbode from the University of Nottingham. Charles is a prominent researcher in environmental psychology. He researches climate change communication and other issues related to climate change and pro-environmental action, pro-environmental behavior. We're really happy to have him. It's going to be a really interesting seminar, I'm sure. And well, without any further ado, I will give Charles the floor. At the end, we will have time for questions and answers as usual. So, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Elena. You're very kind. I would say you're very generous in saying I'm a prominent researcher. I still very much see myself as being in quite an early sort of phase of my career. So basically, the work I'm going to talk about today has been a project we've been working on over the last couple of years. And one of the things I'm going to point out before I begin is usually when I start my talks, I have a slide where I kind of go over what's going to happen, what's coming in the talk. But I'm not going to do that today because I want kind of stay true to the nature of the project, which has kind of been to kind of just go with the questions, go with the story and see where it takes us. So I'll invite you to come along with me as well on this talk and see where it takes us. So I'm going to try as much as possible to fit the talk itself into an hour, and then we'll have about 25, 30 minutes for questions afterwards. Okay, so basically I often start off this talks generally just kind of talking about climate change and how essentially it's a psychological problem. So for a long time we kind of engaged with climate change as a sort of scientific technological problem, but if we kind of think about it, fundamentally, it's a problem for psychology. So one thing, for example, that critics often, or sorry, skeptics often say is, well, but the climate has always changed, etc. You know, how is this anthropogenic? Well, the fact is, it is anthropogenic. Our activities are sort of forcing the climate to change at a rate and in a way that is qualitatively different than it has historically. But what's more relevant for this particular talk is the fact that the drivers, the influences that are driving these changes they're down to human behavior and decision making and things like which are fundamentally psychological issues. So there are three main dimensions I like to kind of think about climate change being a psychological issue. The first is in terms of the cause, so the actions and decisions that lead to more emissions of greenhouse gases. Then there's also the solutions, of course. So we're going to be, you know, our attempts to solve it are going to be through things like changing behaviors, introducing policies that depend on public support, you know, communicating the risks around climate change effectively to people. So the solution side is there, but more relevant to the talk today is the impact side as well. A lot of impacts from climate change are psychological in nature. And if you see this slide here, it kind of shows us the different domains in which we get impacts from climate change. So there's the impacts that come from sort of direct exposure to biophysical events. So when we think about extreme weather, we think about gradual changes in the landscape. So say droughts, say, you know, more sort of extended changes. They have implications psychologically. So we have communities who've been affected. One very sort of recognizable one, for example, is the impacts of the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. We saw how the communities that were impacted by the hurricane were affected. We're seeing things like an increase in a variety of conditions, substance abuse, PTSD, a whole variety of psychological conditions that were triggered by that experience. But then we also have things that are more sort of in the psychosocial domain, which are a bit more, they're not quite as obvious as the direct impact. So one really good example is there's been some research, for example, trying to piece together how the Syrian civil war is linked to climate change. So there was a drought that had been affecting that area for about 3 years before the outbreak of the war. And basically that drought led to a lot of people who would normally be farming in the countryside because their lands were no longer viable. They all moved into the city. So there were lots of unemployed youth so basically sort of working age, able-bodied people in the cities. So when the initial protests broke out, there were just more people that were available to kind of get involved in the conflict, which eventually developed into this this massive civil war that we're all aware of. And so this is just a very rough example of how climate change also feeds into this kinds of psychosocial impacts. So things like conflicts, things like heat-related violence, displacement and migration, or forced migration that come that occur as a consequence of this impact. And then finally, the part that's most relevant to what we're talking about today is the so-called indirect impacts. So these are impacts that affect people who are not necessarily directly exposed to this acute impacts like the extreme weather I mentioned, or the more psychosocial impacts of the conflicts and forced migration and things like that, but are nonetheless meaningful and significant psychological impacts. So for example, we think about climate anxiety and worry, which I'll be talking about in greater depth as we go along. We think about things like people's sense of grief about the sort of degradation of the environment. We think about things like vicarious psychological trauma that comes with that people experience as a result of seeing other people in other parts of the world being affected or suffering from the consequences of climate change. Now, of these three domains, the indirect impacts domain has been the least studied, so that there's been recently a lot of interest in it, but there isn't. The available empirical evidence hasn't really caught up with the level of interest yet. Yet, it's also likely to be the most pervasive channel by which climate change has an impact on us psychologically, because of the fact that, for example, when we think about climate anxiety and worry, you don't even have to be in a place that's directly affected by climate change right now. The only requirement is that you are aware of climate change and you have access to the information, which of course in our internet age, we've got loads of information beamed directly to the palms of our hands. So this is an issue that has potential to become quite a significant challenge. Okay, so before I get back to talking about climate change, I'll very quickly just kind of talk. So as Elena mentioned earlier, the bulk of the work that I've been doing has been around basically trying to identify ways and opportunities for promoting climate change engagement. So, how do we communicate around climate change risks to people in a way that sort of engages them emotionally, motivates them, not just to change, to change their behavior in a more sort of private kind of way, but also to get out and participate in collective actions, protests, that kind of thing around environmental issues. So climate change engagement, broadly speaking, has been described as kind of denoting a sense of personal connection with the issue of climate change, and it kind of breaks down into sort of cognitive, affective, and behavioral components, which you will recognize this from the tripartite model of attitudes. Same kind of clustering has been used to kind of make sense of climate change engagement. And one of the sort of nicest descriptions of the term that I've encountered was by Irene Lorenzoni and colleagues, who said, in very simple terms, climate change engagement refers to knowing, caring, being able, and being motivated to act on climate change. So the particular emphasis of today's talk, of course, is on the caring aspect, which is how people actually feel about climate change, how they connect to climate change emotionally. And the data we're getting from all around the world right now is that people are quite concerned, quite worried about climate change. So the graph to the the figure to the left of the screen is from a 2018 survey of 26 countries around the world. So it was conducted by the Pew Research Center, and overwhelming majorities of people in all of the countries that were surveyed reported that they think about climate change as a significant threat. And then if we fast forward to 2021, on the right hand side of the screen, this graph is from a study that was conducted by the Yale program for climate change communication in collaboration with Facebook. They collected data from people in 31 countries, so large representative samples. And basically what they found again in that was that majority of people from all the different countries, and this country span both the global north and south, the majority of people reported that they were very worried or somewhat worried about climate change. So the level of worry about climate change, that emotional connection with climate change is very strong, is very high. And what's also quite interesting in this current age of COVID-19 is that this worry hasn't been at all dampened by the pandemic. So a recent study that was conducted in the UK in 2020 but a nationally representative sample found that 55% of people in the UK reported that they consider climate change to be a greater threat to the world than COVID-19. So, and this is very encouraging. The fact that obviously, indeed, climate change is a much bigger problem. And while COVID-19 eventually is going to settle down into some kind of new normal, where we'll find ways to live with it, climate change is going to be there. It's a problem that we're going to have to deal with, and there are no simple solutions. Okay, so when we talk about climate change engagement, or when we talk about people's responses to climate change, emotions are a really big part of it. And one of the reasons, basically what you might wonder, well, why does it matter anyway that people are so worried about climate change? And one main reason why we tend to talk about particularly worry a lot is that emotions fundamentally are an essential sub-component of human judgment, human action, human decision-making. So unsurprisingly, they're also very important predictors of the way people respond to climate change. So for example, we have emotions like worry or fear and guilt, which have been linked to pro-environmental attitude change, climate change policy support, and motivation to engage in pro-environmental actions. And positive emotions also serve as motivations for action. But much of the research on climate change communication has kind of focused on negative emotions like worry or fear, guilt, things like that. And one of the reasons for that is that, so for example, a quote that I often go to is from a 2006 paper by Elke Weber, where she says, negative emotions are the wellspring of human actions. And, it's not difficult to kind of see why negative emotions are so important. So, when you're experiencing a negative emotion like worry or fear or anxiety, it's an unpleasant experience. And it's one that unambiguously kind of signals to you that I've got to do something to change the situation, either remove the source of the negative emotion or remove yourself from the situation that's causing you to experience that emotion. So the key thing is that it provides a clear signal to you that you've got to do something, you've got to change something. Whereas when you're experiencing a positive emotion, it doesn't have the same effect. I mean, why would you want to change anything when everything feels good? Why not just carry on doing the same thing? So positive emotions aren't quite as directly linked with sort of attitude or behavior change in the same way that negative emotions are. Also, there's been a lot of evidence, particularly to do with climate change, where researchers are starting to find that actually, as much as there's been a push to kind of say, well, we focus too much on negative emotions, and obviously the downsides that people get burned out, people get overwhelmed, they can feel powerless. Negative emotions don't always lead to constructive responses. People can resort to emotion-focused coping, where they basically, for example, could do something like reframe the understanding of the problem in their minds to reduce the negative emotion without actually addressing the problem. So there are a whole variety of problems with negative emotions. But the solution is not as simple as just saying, okay, so we're going to abandon that and move to positive emotions instead, because actually research shows that for a lot of people, positive emotions like hope are just so almost a form of emotion-focused coping in itself. So 2019 paper by Martijn van Zomeren and colleagues, which was looking at the effect of hope on willingness to participate in collective action. They basically found that hope seemed to serve this function where it made people feel good, but it didn't necessarily make them feel compelled to engage in actions that are aimed at addressing climate change. So basically, all of this I'm saying is not to say that positive emotions do not have any importance in shaping the way people respond to climate change, but I'm just trying to kind of sort of present a profile of why negative emotions are a very intuitive thing to target if your aim is to change people's attitudes or change their behavior regarding environmental problems in general, and climate change, of course, is part of that. And to sort of paraphrase one of the sort of funnier quotes that I've come across around this, it's the title of a paper by Roy Baumeister and colleagues, and he essentially suggests that when it comes to emotions and motivation, bad is stronger than good. Okay, so we know that negative emotions are linked with climate change, are linked with responses to climate change, so policy support, behavior, all that kind of stuff. But then we might think, well, how exactly do these emotions work? So the fundamental, one way in which they work is by guiding people's attention to specific types of information. So usually when you're faced with information about a threatening situation or hazard, the negative emotions that are aroused by that encounter sort of make you or drive you to focus on information that's relevant to resolving the threat. So we tend to look around and think about or focus on information that give us ideas about what response options are available to us to address the threat, which options will be most effective for addressing the threat, and also how capable we are of executing each of those available options. So for example, in this study by Gionso and colleagues, they observed that when people were exposed to information about the risk of meningitis, this information triggered negative emotions, but fear and anxiety in particular. And that fear and anxiety in turn triggered a drive to seek more information, which ultimately led people to develop greater levels of perceived self and response efficacy. So of course, the more you know about what options are available to you, the more you know about the problem, the more you can start to kind of get the sense of being able to address it or at least avoid the risk. Now, a second way that emotions operate is by being a source of information themselves. So, sometimes we have intuitive feelings about things without necessarily having sort of like conscious sort of knowledge of it or some subconscious cognitive evaluation of it. Something just feels intuitively positive or negative. And the important thing about emotions working in this way, it's part of this risk of feelings hypothesis, is that these emotions don't even have to be congruent with our cognitive evaluation. So one example that I like to use is, for example, I feel negative, I feel worried, terrified when I fly, even though cognitively, I'm aware of the fact that flying is safe. I know the plane is not going to fall out of the sky. The chances of that happening are very low. But that cognitive evaluation is totally incongruent with the emotional response I get to the experience. Now, what's important here is that generally, when the emotion and the cognitive evaluation are in conflict, then the emotional feedback tends to take precedence. So even though I know the flying is safe, I avoid it because it makes me feel scared or terrified, or it's just an unpleasant emotional experience for me. So I avoid it. So essentially, those emotions have a much stronger impact on my behavior or my choice than the cognitive evaluation. And then finally, the emotions also function as a sort of feedback system where essentially they shape our learning, they shape, what kinds of behaviors we select on the basis of either a memory of a previous emotional experience or anticipation of a prospective emotional experience. So for example, I might think about an action that occurred in the past. Say I was hungry last week and I had a beef burger for lunch. But after having that beef burger, I felt very guilty because of the environmental impact of the beef. So next time I find myself in that situation where I have to make a choice about having lunch, I might remember how I felt guilty and how bad that was, and avoid, maybe go for a vegetarian option instead to avoid having that sense of guilt. So in that way, the emotions and the memory of the emotions kind of shape my choices as well. And there's also been a lot of research about things like anticipated pride, for example, where we think about positive emotions that might occur in the future as a result of some kind of action, and that drives us to select the action. As there's also things like anticipated negative, like anticipated guilt. You might avoid an action because you know that it might lead to this negative feelings in the future. Okay, so now we've kind of talked about, we know that people are very worried about climate change in most parts of the world. Large majorities of people are. We know how, we've kind of talked about how emotions work. And recently, there's been this sort of surge in public interest in the concept of climate anxiety. So as I mentioned earlier, climate anxiety kind of falls within the domain of the so-called indirect impacts of climate change. And just to a quick sort of rewind to how I kind of came into studying climate anxiety. So as I said, most of my research was about communication, how can we connect with people? How can we motivate them to be more pro-environmental? And a big part of that involved things like how can we basically communicate with people so they're appropriately worried about the risk of climate change. So they recognize the risk and they have a commensurate level of worry about what this risk actually means. Now, of course, worry shapes our behaviors and our actions, but it doesn't only function as a motivation. It can also have an impact on our mental health and well-being. And so over the last few years, there's been growing public interest in how this escalating levels of public worry about climate change might be having an impact on people's mental health and well-being. And now, also, as I mentioned previously, you don't even have to be directly exposed to climate change impacts to develop climate change anxiety. All you need is an awareness of climate change. So essentially, the range of people that could be impacted quite significantly by climate anxiety is practically boundless. And essentially, as the climate change impacts have become more perceptible, more visible around the world, so you might think about the flooding, for example, that happened in Germany earlier in the year, or the heat waves that scorched the west coast of North America in the late spring, early summer as well. There are just a whole variety of these events happening all over the world, and they're, with the internet-enabled information technologies, with the information about these events are beamed to us almost instantaneously, and so this is potentially a big part of the drivers of this surge in climate change worry that we're seeing. Now, the problem is with climate change, unlike other kinds of risks, like financial risks or health risks, where an individual can take actions unilaterally to resolve the problem, climate change is much more complex, and you need, billions of people essentially around the world to cooperate and act in a coordinated way to resolve the problem. So it's not very easy to remove climate change, as a source of worry. And also because the climate obviously extends all over the planet and is so intertwined with the systems that support life on Earth, we can't really avoid the problem either. We all have to exist in this world on the, within this climate, this changed climate, and we have to deal with it. So essentially, there's a lot of room for worry about climate change to just continue to escalate. Now, worry is the core feature of anxiety disorders. So we've seen that worry can motivate people to act pro-environmentally or support climate change policies, but climate change worry is also linked to psychological distress. So, there's definitely evidence already before climate anxiety never came about, which was suggesting to us that climate change worry has potential to harm people's mental health. And the graph that I showed you earlier on kind of showed the level and the spread of climate change worry around the world. And essentially, recently people have kind of been interpreting that as almost like a map of the range of people that are vulnerable or potentially affected by climate change anxiety. Now, the other thing to note here that's really important is that climate anxiety is a lot more than worry. So worry is a part of it, but climate change anxiety also involves a range of other different emotions. And some of these emotions are actually they conflict with one another. So people who experience climate change anxiety, we'll talk about experiences of things like worry, anger, fear, guilt, even hopelessness and despair. It seems to be one of the situations where people just kind of move about in their emotional states, and it's quite a complex emotional experience. So basically, it's really difficult to provide a simple definition of what climate anxiety is, other than to say, obviously, it's a subset of eco-anxiety, which is a broader, anxiety is about a broader sort of body of environmental problems. And eco-anxiety has been defined by the American Psychological Association as a chronic fear of ecological doom. So if we extrapolate from that, we can basically say that climate anxiety is like a chronic negative emotional response to anticipated climate catastrophe. Now, the anticipated part of that definition is also very important. So climate anxiety, by and large, is a response to what people fear or expect will happen as a result of unabated global warming. And this is quite important because it differentiates climate anxiety from other forms of psychological distress or trauma that people might suffer as a consequence of climate change impacts that are occurring right now. So for example, when I talked about the victims of Hurricane Katrina, who might have experienced psychological trauma, distress, PTSD, all sorts of psychological impacts from their experience of that event, that's quite different from the sorts of trauma and sorts of impacts that people might have from their expectation of what climate change might mean, or what it might cause, or what impacts it might have on them in the future. Now, secondly, unlike generalized anxiety disorders, for example, climate anxiety is not inherently pathological. So chronic fear of anticipated sort of negative impacts from climate change is quite rational. The problem is escalating. We haven't seen very much progress on the political front, so there's reason to be worried about it. So it's a totally rational response to the problem. But not only is it rational, it is also functional insofar that climate change anxiety can actually sort of motivate people to reduce their change their behavior so that they can reduce their impact on the environment, which of course then translates to reducing the threat of climate change. So generally it's functional, except sometimes it's not. Now, in some cases, elevated levels of climate change anxiety can impair people's psychological functioning. So it makes it difficult. People get so anxious about climate change, it makes it difficult for them, for example, to sleep well, or to maintain healthy social relationships, or to be productive in their work or studies. And not everyone is equally so subject to this effect. So research suggests, for example, that the psychological impacts from climate anxiety might be particularly acute amongst young people, amongst people like researchers or indigenous people who have really sort of deep knowledge of the natural environment and the ongoing changes, and also who might live in very close connection with the natural environment. In addition to that, climate anxiety can also exacerbate pre-existing psychiatric conditions, so like depression or suicide ideation or substance abuse and things like that. So climate anxiety essentially can work either as a trigger for this negative psychological impact, or it can amplify pre-existing conditions. And over and above those psychological impacts, climate anxiety also has potential sociocultural impacts. So one of the most prominent ones is the link between climate change anxiety and people choosing not to have kids. So for example, this 2020 study by Schneider Mason and Kit Long gathered data from a large sample of Americans aged between 27 and 45. And the majority of people in this study reported that they were very concerned about the carbon footprint of having children. A very large majority of the sample also said that they were extremely concerned about the well-being of their existing children, or the expected or hypothetical children in a world affected by climate change. So some of the quotes from participants in the study include this quote is from a 27-year-old lady who has no children. And she says, well, I can't in good conscience bring a child into this world and force them to try and survive what may be apocalyptic conditions. Similarly, a 40-year-old teacher who's also a mother said, I regret having my kids because I'm terrified that they will be facing the end of the world due to climate change. So people have very strong emotional reactions to this expected apocalyptic or this expected apocalypse that might occur because of climate change. And it's got this knock-on effect for, it seems, a large number of people in terms of their desire to have children. Now, I hope that basically from the all the things I've described so far, I've managed to kind of build up an impression of just how climate change anxiety is, the significance of climate change anxiety as a phenomenon and also as a concept. So as a phenomenon, it's significant because it potentially has, severe implications for mental health, for well-being, as well as for important sociocultural and even, biological practices and functioning. It's also practically boundless with regards to who can be affected by it. Basically, anyone who's aware of climate change can be affected by it. And then as a concept, it's really important because it basically provides a wide range of stakeholders. So we're talking about researchers, activists, mental health practitioners, clinicians, parents, educators, etc. It provides us with a common language to talk about the range of negative emotional responses people have or people are experiencing in response to climate change, and also what the health and social implications of these responses might be. Now, having said that, the research and discourse around climate anxiety is not without its problems. So this is the fun part. So the entire significance and import of climate anxiety rests on this idea of an apocalyptic future. So the visions or expectations that people have about this impending apocalypse. And it's a common theme in accounts by researchers, as well as people who self-identify as having been affected by climate anxiety. It's this idea that basically there is a future in which a world which right now feels familiar, it feels comfortable, it's predictable, it's relatively safe, becomes so destabilized as to practically cease to exist. So essentially, people fear for the end of the world. They're worried that the world as we know it is going to end, and it's almost like there's some kind of Alcyon ecological past which basically we can't go back to, and it's all over. But what's really important to note, as Audra Mitchell and Aditya Chowdhury sort of explore in this article, is that the main contributors to articulating these visions, this narrative of apocalypse, are almost exclusively white. It's a very sort of white-led narrative. So I don't know if some of you might be aware of a few names that come to mind, like David Wallace Wells, who wrote the essay on the uninhabitable Earth, or Jem Bendel, who came up with the idea of deep adaptation. These people have kind of made a name for themselves by essentially trying to conjure up visions or notions of a world where it's just an apocalyptic future. But the problem with orienting our reactions to climate change around those ideas, or around this idea of future apocalypse, it's not just about the skin color of the people who are pushing the narrative the hardest, pushing the narrative the hardest, but the more important problem is that these narratives systematically exclude sort of knowledge systems and perspectives from Black and Indigenous people of color that don't have quite as apocalyptic a vision of the future. The other thing is, in these narratives, people think about the climate breakdown mainly in a temporal dimension. So it's kind of like, well, the world we live in today is, the way it is, and things are just going to get worse as we go on into the future. And they very conveniently ignore the fact that if we think laterally, even in the world we live in today, the impacts of climate breakdown are not equally distributed across different groups. So we can think about the unequal distribution of climate risk, say, across the global north and south, between the people who have and who have not, the privileged, less privileged, the white hegemonic entities and the racialized global majority. The whole variety of ways we can apportion it. But what's really clear is that even today, in this so-called world that we're trying to save, some people are already experiencing hell right now. So this idea of a future that we might go to, which is going to be apocalyptic, where everything's going to collapse, some people are already there. So essentially the main consequence of this oversight is that the whole apocalyptic narrative is just not a very rigorous sort of discourse on the current global ecological crisis. Because essentially for many people around the world, the climate apocalypse is not an anticipated outcome. It is already here. So now coming back to climate change anxiety, we see that it's an overwhelmingly, when it comes to the scientific evidence and comes to the discourse around it, it's a very, very wide phenomenon. And so the question that kind of spurred the projects that I'm going to be describing today was, well, is climate anxiety just a thing for the global north? Is it just a wide phenomenon then? Or is it more, how much does it generalize more globally? Given that climate change obviously is a global problem. So that was the core question that drove the work. Now, before I get on to describing what we actually did in the project, I also want to highlight that since we started working on the project in 2019, and since then, there's been quite a lot of effort to make the work around climate anxiety more diverse, and it'll be and I'll just try to sort of flag some of that work here. So. For example, we have this study that was published by Reyes and colleagues earlier in this year, which looked at the link between climate change anxiety and psychological distress amongst young people in the Philippines. There's another study by Hiran and colleagues, which looked at the link between, which found that climate anxiety basically is linked with functional impairments for about 20% of people in a large sample that was gathered from 8 French-speaking African and European countries. And there's also another very large study that was published recently by Elizabeth Marks, Caroline Hickman and colleagues, which looked at young people aged 16 to 24 in 10 countries around the world, including Brazil, India, Philippines, and Nigeria. And that study also showed that for around 45% of people, young adults who participated, not only do they have the strong negative emotional responses to climate change, but those emotions are also having a negative impact on their daily life and sort of psychological functioning. So I wanted to highlight this to just kind of, even though I'm going to be very critical about the topic and the field as we go along, I also want to do what's it called, honor the people who are working to kind of change some of these issues that I'm raising as I go along. Okay, so the project I'm going to be discussing today is called the MECAM project, which stands for Media Exposure, Climate Anxiety, and Mental Health. So the researchers involved were a consortium of 41 researchers spread across 32 countries, which was formed in the summer of 2019. And we sort of set out to basically answer 3 main questions, which was 1, to see the extent to which sort of negative emotional responses to climate change, so climate anxiety, the extent to which it relates to mental health and well-being in diverse cultural contexts. We also wanted to try to understand, what gives rise to climate anxiety? Where does climate anxiety come from? What factors predict who experiences, higher levels of climate anxiety and so on? And finally, we wanted to establish the comparative influence of climate anxiety on mental health compared with pro-environmental action. Because as I said, there's this tension between, well, worry and anxiety and the whole climate anxiety complex. Is it more of a functional thing? Is it more a motivation for action? Or is it more of a psychological stressor, psychological essentially a channel for climate change to impact us, our mental health negatively? So we gathered data with a survey, which was at the sort of conclusion of the study. We managed to get data from 28 countries. Our data collection was disrupted by COVID, but fortunately we got data from about 25 countries before the lockdowns kind of took hold globally, and then we did another 3 in the last year while there were some release from the lockdowns. But anyway, overall, across this time period, we gathered data from just under 11,000 people, and because the samples are not representative, we're essentially kind of capitalizing on university research participant pools and other forms of opportunity and convenience sampling. So our sample overall is kind of skewed towards a younger demographic who are highly educated. We also have a slight representation of females in the sample. Okay, and basically this is just a graphical description, illustration of some of the main hypotheses that we tested in our analysis. So to the left of the figure, we have the antecedents of climate anxiety, which we explored in this study. So it's been sort of widely speculated that sort of rising consciousness of climate change around the world, and by extension, the worry, anxiety, and all of that comes along with that, that all of this is linked to this ubiquitous access to information through ICT. But there's very little evidence that actually shows the link between the amount of media you consume and your concern about climate change, or indeed your level of climate anxiety. So we sort of hypothesized that people's rate of exposure to climate change related media would be positively linked to their climate anxiety. We also hypothesized that the amount of attention that people pay to information about climate change would have a unique positive impact as well, because there's research showing that attention has an effect over and above just the amount of information you're exposed to. And then we also explored the idea that the content of the information also matters. So does the information focus on the cause of climate change, the impacts of climate change, the solutions, so ongoing solutions, or maybe, for example, you could think about newspaper articles about the protests and things like that. How does that affect people's responses? So we hypothesized that cause and impacts information would have a positive effect on climate anxiety, while solutions information would have a negative effect. It would reduce climate change anxiety. And then the other thing we considered was social norms. So we broke that down into two categories. So the descriptive norms, which capture how sort of social reference that are important to the individual are responding emotionally to climate change. So for example, something like, people around me express concern when they talk about climate change. And then we also captured injunctive norms, which is about the social expectations. So what do people who are close to you, your family, your friends, people in your age group, that kind of thing, what do they expect? How do they expect you to respond to climate change? And we predicted that essentially both of these variables would have a positive effect on climate anxiety. So the more concern people around you express, the more you feel the sense of that there's an expectation that you should be concerned about climate change, the more likely it is that you will experience climate anxiety. And then finally, we hypothesized that climate change anxiety would be positively linked to experiences of extreme weather, on the basis that there is a lot of evidence in the literature about how events like flooding, heat waves, hurricanes, tornadoes, that sort of thing are significantly related to concern about climate change and worry. So we extrapolated from that and said, well, it probably fits into, or they have the hypothesis was that these experiences would have a positive effect on climate anxiety. Now, on the right side of the figure, we have the proposed outcomes of climate anxiety. So we have the self-reported mental health, which was a one-item measure. We have the WHO-5, so the World Health Organization 5-item index for mental well-being. We also have climate action, which was a question that asked people if they participated in a protest for climate within a year leading up to the time of data collection. And then finally, we had multi-item index of pro-environmental behavior. So those behaviors kind of focus more around things like consumption in the sub-personal sphere. So we'll ask people questions like, do you cycle rather than drive a car? Do you try to limit your food waste? Do you try to cut back on how often you buy new clothes? So, questions like that. Anyway, the full questionnaire can be found on OSF using the link at the bottom of the page here. And I'm also happy to share that with anyone who's interested, can email me after the talk as well. Okay, so yeah, of course, so we predicted that climate anxiety would be negatively related to self-rated mental health and mental well-being, and positively related to climate action and pro-environmental behavior. Okay, so looking at the results about just some preliminary results about climate anxiety. So the measure of climate anxiety was a 7-item scale, which is loosely based on the state anxiety dimension of the state trait anxiety inventory, the STI, which is quite an established measure of anxiety. And basically, we asked participants to focus their thoughts on how they feel about climate change, and then they rated 7 descriptors to say, how strongly or not they were feeling those things about climate change at the present moment, so at the time of data collection. So the descriptors were, do you feel calm? Do you feel tense? Do you feel relaxed? Do you feel anxious? Do you feel peaceful? Do you feel worried? Or do you feel terrified when you think about climate change? Now, for the sake of time, I'm only presenting the patterns or the responses to the anxiety and worry items. And the reason why I do that in particular is because, as I said, worry is this core component of anxiety, right? But also, more importantly, in a lot of the background on climate anxiety, when people are kind of making this case for why climate anxiety is important, they often point at evidence for worry, for the distribution of worry about climate change. And of course, the first thing that you see when you look at this graph is that people's ratings of their level of worry is so much higher, it's very different than their ratings of the level of anxiety. So worry is the yellow bars and anxiety are the blue bars. And we have, people rating like well over 70% of the samples from Brazil and from Spain, and very close in Portugal as well. There's large proportions are reporting that they're very or extremely anxious very or extremely worried about climate change. Whereas the highest level of anxiety we had was from Brazil, where just about, I think it was 43% of people said they were very or extremely anxious about climate change. So there seems to be a difference in people's minds in how they interpret each of this emotions. So there's a lesson in there for people like me, including me, who's been sort of citing the data on worry to make a case for climate change anxiety. Hopefully, of course, as more studies get done as we go forward and we have more data, we can begin to just kind of focus on the sort of climate anxiety data specifically. The other thing that's really interesting here is that there is quite a marked variation in the levels of worry and anxiety across different countries. So we've got a high of 77.6% of participants in Spain reporting that they're very or extremely worried about climate change. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have a very low proportion of participants in Russia. So 9.6% of people from Russia said they were extremely worried or very worried about climate change. And when we look at anxiety, we see the same thing as well. So in Brazil, you've got 43.6% of people saying that they're very anxious, whereas we only have 5% of people saying that they're anxious about climate change in Russia. So there's quite a lot of variation basically across these different countries in how people feel about the issue. Now, on the other hand, we then also looked at the correlations between climate change anxiety and self-rated mental health and the well-being index. And I mean, both of these indicators are very strongly related in most of the countries. They're very highly correlated. So the relationships as well with climate anxiety are fairly comparable in most contexts, but not all. So across the board, we see that there are mostly small to moderate correlations between climate anxiety and mental health and mental well-being. And later on in the discussion, I'll come back to why this is significant. Climate anxiety was significantly correlated with self-reported mental health in 24 out of the 28 countries that we surveyed. And it was also significantly correlated with mental well-being in 23 out of the 28 countries. So from the zero order correlations alone, we can already see that this relationship between these negative emotions we have about climate change and mental health and well-being is not something that's just limited to the countries of the global north. This is, appears to be a global phenomenon. In fact, some of the strongest correlations between these emotions and mental health we observed in countries like Chile, in Pakistan, and the United Arab Emirates. Okay, so to kind of to assess that our hypothesis about the antecedents of climate anxiety, we constructed a hierarchical linear model with random intercepts for country. So basically, the random intercepts means that we're accounting for the fact that climate anxiety on average varies across different countries. So I apologize, this is a very ugly table. It's very difficult to find a way to present multi-level stuff in an attractive way. I'll try not to spend too much time on this slide. But anyway, when we look across the entire sample, we see that the rate of exposure to information about climate change doesn't have a significant effect on people's climate anxiety. But what does have an effect is the amount of attention they pay to this information, as well as whether the information is about climate change impacts. So if you encounter information about climate change causes, it doesn't really seem to have much of an effect. If you encounter information about climate change solutions, that doesn't seem to have much of an effect either, but the impact is really important. Now, potentially, the reason why that is that people already feel kind of negative about climate change. So when you encounter information about other ongoing impacts of climate change, it's much easier for that information to amplify the way you already feel than information about, say, solutions, for example, to like totally change how you feel. So that's a possibility, a possible explanation of that. And then when we look at norms, surprisingly, what people observed others doing, others around them doing, didn't really seem to have much. Well, it didn't have a significant effect. So thinking that other young people around you or your family members or people you know are concerned about climate change, or they express concern to you about climate change, doesn't seem to have an impact. But what's really important is what people around you expect of you. And this perceived sort of social expectation to react to climate change in a certain way is positively sort of linked to climate change anxiety. And then finally, and this was a really surprising result, is that contrary to what we hypothesized, the extreme weather events basically just had the opposite of what we predicted. So flooding experiences did not have a significant impact at all, or such significant relationship at all with climate anxiety, whereas experiences of other events, so we gave people examples like hurricanes or tornadoes or freak storms and things like that, those seem to have a negative effect. So they essentially reduced climate change anxiety. And I'll come back to talking about potential reasons why that might be the case in the discussion. But to round this up, we also saw, which is in line with the literature, that age and gender were significantly related. So females, female participants on the whole, tended to report higher levels of climate change anxiety, while older respondents reported less. So it seems to be more, it's stronger amongst sort of younger participants. Okay, and then flipping to the other side and looking at the outcomes of climate anxiety. So again, I apologize, this is a really large table. It's going to take a bit of time to explain, but do bear with me. So for the sake of time, I'm only going to discuss the results that relate to the relationship between climate change anxiety and well-being, because as I said, well-being, the mental well-being measure and the self-reported mental health measure, they're very closely related and the results are very similar, but I'm choosing to focus on mental well-being because it's a more rigorous measure, and it's also been validated in a whole variety of cultural contexts. Okay, so there's also an important difference between the results I'm presenting here and the ones that I presented on the previous slide, because here, in addition to having this random intercepts, which accounts for variation in the mean levels of the outcome across countries, we also have random slopes for climate anxiety. So what the random slopes mean is that we are accounting for the fact that climate anxiety, the relationship or the effects of climate anxiety on pro-environmental behavior or mental well-being will vary in magnitude across different countries. And basically we compared the models that included this random intercepts with this random slopes with one that didn't have random slopes, and this model fit better. So that's why I'm presenting that today. So starting from the left, we can see that climate change anxiety has a significant positive relationship with pro-environmental behavior, but it doesn't significantly predict engagement in climate protests. So now remember the slopes for the for climate anxiety predicting these outcomes vary across countries. So when we plot this random slopes, this is what we get. So the numbers at the bottom basically correspond to the different countries. So the countries are organized in alphabetical order. So number 1 represents Australia, number 2 is Brazil, number 3 is Canada. It goes all the way to number 28, which is the UK. And what this graph basically is showing us is that the link between climate anxiety and pro-environmental behavior is only significant in 13 out of the 28 countries that we surveyed. And essentially we can tell what's a significant effect by whether or not the confidence intervals cross the zero, whether they cross zero. Okay. Similarly, when we plot the random slopes for climate action, so this is whether or not people participated in protests about climate change, we see that climate anxiety only significantly predicts the likelihood of engaging in protest about climate change in 7 out of 28 countries that we surveyed. And the other important factor here is that all of these 7 countries are relatively affluent European liberal democracies. So basically what this seems to be suggesting is that there are some structural barriers at the country level that might limit people's ability to channel their climate anxiety into pro-environmental behavior. And we'll come back to that. So now returning to our table, we also see that climate anxiety has a significant negative relationship with mental well-being overall, even though the slope again varies across countries. And when we plot those random slopes, it looks very different from what we had with behavior, because here we see that this negative effect is significant in all the countries. The magnitude kind of varies. So, climate anxiety has a stronger impact on well-being in some countries than others, but in every single country, there is a significant negative relationship between climate anxiety and mental well-being. And basically what this is suggesting is that irrespective of where you live or your cultural background, climate anxiety can potentially undermine your mental well-being. Okay. So I appreciate that there's been a lot of information that I've just kind of dumped on you, and do feel free, please, to bring me back to other parts of the talk when we get to the questions section. But just a few discussion points and concluding reflections. So essentially what we see from the data that we have from our project is that climate anxiety is a global phenomenon. It seems to be affecting people, or it seems to be a thing that is measurable. We can see it in people from all different nationalities, all different cultural backgrounds, but there are also some potential local nuances to how it's experienced, what impacts it has. Now with the survey data, obviously we're not really able to capture how people experience climate anxiety, but we can see some interesting patterns in how climate change anxiety relates to mental well-being, for example. So we see that there's some countries where the levels of self-reported worry or anxiety are quite low. So you might think, like Russia, for example, where quite a small proportion of people indicated that they were, highly worried or anxious. Yet comparatively speaking, the relationship between the negative emotions about climate change and mental well-being is quite strong compared with the other countries. It's quite strong in Russia. Whereas on the other hand, you get countries like Spain or I think Uganda and Tanzania, where they're very high self-rated levels of worry and anxiety about climate change, but that doesn't really seem to translate to well-being impact. The relationship between those emotions and well-being is quite small. So there are questions there to be asked about, are there resources that are available to people in different cultural contexts? Are there different ways of making sense of these emotions that may, in some situations, essentially kind of minimize the negative mental health, mental well-being impacts of this strong emotional responses to climate change? Then also now thinking about the antecedents of climate anxiety, it clearly from the results that we found, it's not just a matter of, well, how much information do you consume about climate change? How much, information about natural disasters or whatever are you exposed to? It's not really that simple. Obviously, when we look at the landscape of climate change messaging, it's a very pluralistic pluralistic landscape. Not everyone is singing from the same hymn book. Not everyone is saying, oh, climate change is going to be our greatest priority. We have to be dealing with it. There are skeptics out there. There are people who are outright deniers. There are all kinds of things going on in this media landscape. So what's really important is what you pay attention to and how much attention you pay to it. So impact information in particular seems to be linked to climate anxiety. So the more people see information about how climate change is causing suffering, how it's harming people, harming valuable ecosystems around the world, the more it escalates their climate anxiety. And also, while it's quite difficult to unpack the relationship between attention and climate anxiety, because obviously paying attention to this kind of information can cause you to, or can amplify your climate anxiety. But again, there's a feedback loop where the more anxious you become, if you remember, negative emotions shape what information you pay attention to. You can also get stuck in a feedback loop where your anxiety also makes you pay more attention to that information, and so it goes. But there'll be a need for a variety of different approaches to answering this question to be able to really kind of unpack what's going on with that. And then another important point is about thinking about climate change anxiety or climate anxiety as a normative phenomenon. So there's been a lot of focus on trying to kind of promote this idea or put forward this idea that climate anxiety is rational and it's functional. So it's kind of like, obviously, given what we understand about the reality of the situation with climate change, then the rational response is to be anxious about it because it's anxiety inducing. But what we don't hear a lot about is how the experience of it and the expression of it is also a normative phenomenon. It's occurring within a social environment, a particular social landscape, and that influences the way people express those emotions. So for example, when we think about, particularly among young people who constitute the majority of our sample, they're exposed to information through social media about, say, the emergence of the international climate activist movement, and all that information. We see what sorts of actions people like Greta Thunberg getting involved in. They youth activists in particular, for example, really advocate things like hope. We've got to be hopeful. We've got to be angry about political inaction, all that kind of stuff. They essentially putting out social normative cues out there, which kind of tell us this is how you should be responding. This is how you should be feeling about this problem. It's a source of information on its own. So if you're feeling kind of ambiguous about climate change, well, how worried should I be, etc., then you've got these people that are modeling this particular kind of responses within your sort of social sphere. That there is a normative kind of influence that comes from that, which also seems to significantly shape the degree to which people experience climate change anxiety. And then another interesting point from the results we have is what's going on with the extreme weather experiences. So we were kind of expecting that, the more people experience this extreme weather events, which, the theory goes that it makes climate change feel more concrete, where it might otherwise feel abstract and distant. It should it should stimulate these negative emotions and basically feed into climate anxiety. But we're not really seeing that in the data. What we're seeing instead is that it especially for other events that are not like excluding flooding, what we're seeing is that it's actually inversely related to climate anxiety. And I mean, potentially one of the issues there is, as I was saying, about the whole idea of climate anxiety being based around impending future traumas, anticipated traumas. The difference is that with extreme weather, it's already happened to you. So you're having to react to it, you're adapting to it, you're trying to survive, that people can come out of these experiences feeling more efficacious. So if, for example, my old house got washed away by flooding, and then I band together with other people in my community and we try to rebuild and things like that, we'll come away from that experience feeling, more connected, feeling more, like we've survived, and that is a very positive sort of feeling, positive experience. So there's this chance there that that kind of experience basically counteracts the likelihood of experiencing climate anxiety. And then finally, I guess the biggest message that I hope you'll take away from the presentation today is the fact that although there's been that push to talk about climate anxiety, it's been mainly rational, mainly constructive. It has a motivational influence in terms of sort of driving people to engage in pro-environmental actions that will, we hope will resolve the climate crisis. The fact is, the ability of people to translate their anxieties about climate change into action is subject to a whole variety of situational influences. So if you think about protesting, for example, if you don't live in a democratic, liberal country that allows you to express your political voice in that way, then that option is just not available to you. If you don't live in a country where you get a choice to have, the vegetarian option, or so for example, I'm Nigerian, and if I went back home and I was talking to my family and I said, oh, you know what, I think I'll skip the meat today and I'll have, it's just not a thing. It's not a part of the cultural discourse. I mean, this is a very trivial example, but it's just saying that it's just to illustrate that basically our social cultural context is so varied, and that's tied into our abilities to kind of enact this difference of pro-environmental behaviors. Whereas on the other hand, when we think about the well-being impacts of climate anxiety, you don't have any limits. The fact that you're not able to go out and protest, the fact that you're not able to, go out and pick the green option or reduce your energy use, all that, the fact that you don't have those options, that is not an exemption from suffering negative mental health impacts from climate anxiety. So I think there needs to be a stronger emphasis as well on this well-being dimension of climate anxiety. We've got to also push this idea that, look, climate anxiety, not only does it have a potential to have this mental well-being impact, but that potential is globalized. Regardless of where you are in the world, you can be affected. Your well-being can be undermined by climate anxiety. And then finally, I'll be amiss, obviously, not to talk about some of the limitations of the study. So first of all, I mean, this, I'm not sure if it's a limitation or not, but it's also worth mentioning just because at the time we launched this study in 2019, for those of you who might be familiar with the climate anxiety literature, there are a number of measures that have been published now. So validated measures of climate anxiety, which didn't exist at the time. So our emphasis was mainly on the emotional components of climate anxiety. Whereas a lot of these new measures that have been produced kind of assume functional impairment. So functional impairment, things like loss of sleep or loss of productivity or poor social relationships and all that have been built into the measure of climate anxiety. We don't assume that that's the case, only because the assumption that this emotions necessarily translates to functional impairment is also something that's come out of a particular cultural tradition. So we were trying to kind of come across it in terms of approach the question by keeping it open and seeing how. So, for example, some of the questions would be things like in this new measures would be to ask people, do you struggle to sleep because of your level of concern by climate change or because of your anxiety about climate change? Now, personally, I don't consider that to be a good way to establish a relationship between your anxiety and your lack of sleep, because people are not necessarily going to be able to accurately judge what's causing them to lose sleep. There could be a variety of other things. So our approach basically was to measure these things separately and see how they relate to one another. Another limitation is the fact that the data we have is cross-sectional, is non-representative. As I said, it over-represents young people, female respondents. Some of this arguments we're making about causal relationships between climate anxiety and mental well-being, or exposure to information and climate anxiety, they still require experimental approaches, longitudinal studies to establish that that's the case. Fortunately, there are studies that are starting to emerge that are doing things like that as well. So a recent study by Tatiana Milfant and colleagues kind of showed sort of relatedly that concern about climate change, so this was a longitudinal study, over the course of 1 year, concern about climate change had a negative impact, was related to levels of psychological distress amongst the national sample of people from New Zealand. And then finally, there's the consideration of COVID. So as I mentioned earlier, our data collection was disrupted by COVID. Much of the data we gathered actually outside of the COVID period, but we had data from 3 countries. So India, Palestine, and the United Arab Emirates. We collected that data in 2020 when the lockdowns were already in place. And there's the question of the degree to which, obviously, this is a very unusual and stressful period. So people may already have elevated levels of psychological distress or poor mental health, and then we're suddenly seeing evidence that that is happening around the world. So potentially that might have also influenced the results that we're seeing in those places. Now, from our exploration of the data, we haven't seen any marked differences between people who, or between the data that were collected in the pre-COVID era and the COVID period, but that's still something that's worth bearing in mind as well. Okay, so what next? Going forward from here, we're trying to dig a bit deeper into some of the findings. So I'm involved in a project which is currently going on in the Pacific Islands, so but in Fiji and Solomon Islands, where we're focusing on adolescents and young adults, and we're looking broadly at psychological adaptation to climate change, part of which includes how people kind of deal with their emotional responses to climate change as well. And in addition to that, we're also launching a mixed methods study that not only takes the normal quantitative approach to measure eco-anxiety or climate anxiety among young people in the Philippines, but we're also going to go do interviews and have open-ended responses where people can really kind of help us flesh out our understanding about how people in this particular non-Western context experience climate change, how it impacts them on a day-to-day, and hopefully from these studies, we're hoping to get more understanding to kind of build up our knowledge of climate anxiety across the world right now. Okay, so before I round up, I just want to say a huge thanks to my collaborators, without whom it would have been impossible to do the study. So I want to say thanks to them for their trust, their patience, and for just demonstrating team spirit all through the project. So, and thanks to you guys in the audience as well for listening. As I mentioned earlier, do feel free to contact me by email or visit my lab or personal website if you're interested in learning more about the research, you want to request materials, data, whatever, feel free to get in touch. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charles. That was an exciting talk. So much to think about, and I'm sure we have a lot of questions actually that can be discussed. So I'll probably open the discussion just with a few sort of questions, remarks, and you're free to answer them as we go along. Maybe some will overlap with what others have. So, well, Russia, of course, yeah, it's not an unexpected result. We do get similar findings with climate change concern.
Oh, right. Okay.
In Russia, yeah. So I think our main sort of concern and anxiety nowadays is at least to make people to make people believe that climate change is actually a global threat.
Yeah.
So, from there to get to climate change anxiety is probably still a long way, but it's something that that could be explored. It's an interesting topic for sure.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I have been thinking through, from the beginning of your talk actually till the end is the point where basically climate change becomes a source of maladaptive response, like climate anxiety versus environmental concern, which we know is linked to pro-environmental action. And that's probably what we want, because I kind of sorry for the terminology, but I get really pissed, especially when I hear from researchers about that we need to focus on adaptation and not mitigation. And my main whatever I would like to do around environmental psychology nowadays is to think about pro-environmental action, because that's what we ought to try as a generation. And if we don't do, then it may be too late. So anyway, on so many levels, if we don't talk about climate change, about other things, we can see the impact, anthropogenic impact on our planet. So it's really important, I think. So my main question throughout was, question number one is, what is the turning point between maladaptive response and adaptive response to climate change problems, / environmental problems? Where do we get, from which point we start to get eco-anxiety, and at which point we actually get a more sort of, adaptive response, like potentially, the difference probably here with the environmental concern. So that's probably my most important question. I'll just ask two more things. If you could comment on climate change anxiety and pro-environmental behavior, the results that you got. If you could go a little bit more in depth, because that could be really, really interesting. Also, geographically, it's probably just a reflection, but geographically, it seems to be probably the case that more because you had in the first graphs that you showed, the countries and anxiety and worry, and you could see kind of clearly some of the data sort of reflected the South. The South is sort of more worried, and some of the graphs not from your study but from the background that you present. Whereas Russia and Canada, who are at the moment probably the two, and the US also the third one, the countries that are so much concerned by climate change because the pace of climate change is much quicker in the north at the moment, to some degree, because of the back loops and the trigger. Forgot the term, tipping points, the permafrost melting and so on and so forth. So it's kind of really, really rapidly changing, but the anxiety is kind of, and the concern is much lower somehow. So that could be interesting, but I don't know. Maybe it's something that it's those who are more concerned with, sort of concerned in the sense that those who are more kind of involved in the situation are more anxious. I don't know. It's probably one of the things to reflect, and possibly as we go with as this situation develops, kind of goes contrary to your results now, I think. But I'm wondering if as the thing progresses, maybe we will have more climate anxiety, or probably not, as from what you are showing is that it's not necessarily those with experience, which again kind of sends us more to those with experience probably will develop environmental concern rather than anxiety. I don't know. And then, and Greta, just one thing I wanted to just say here is that Greta's movement definitely made, and all the sort of connected phenomena that we observed, like Extinction Rebellion and climate strikes around the world and other sort of associated movements, definitely do give us this normative a response that it's good to be angry, it's good to be anxious, and so on. But I think they also brought such a positive thing about with them is that politicians have to act, and they have to act immediately. Well, if that gave some kind of normative, effect, which is great. But it's just
no, definitely. I mean, thanks. Those are really good questions, actually. I think I'll start with the Greta one, and I'll move to the geographical differences, and I'll do the pro-environmental behavior one last, because I think that will require more elaborate exploration. But so starting with Greta, I mean, I picked her as a random example. I don't really know how Greta is linked to climate anxiety. I mean, there's a research question in there for somebody. But I know that Greta obviously has been linked to collective action. People being more interested. In fact, I was very excited about the movement when it first started off, because, I mean, I still am. Because for the first time, certainly in my life experience, it felt to me like environmental action, like protesting and stuff, became democratized. It wasn't just like hippies and people who are particularly keen on environment. It was like everybody, your classmate, your, just any random person, your mom was in the protest, everyone. And I think that is part of the power of the movement, is the fact that it allowed for people from all different walks of life to kind of connect around this issue. So that's really important. But I think we shouldn't underestimate that normative effect. It's really important that not everyone who is involved in this much is walking down the street necessarily has the same amount of information or even necessarily feels the same way as you do. But there's this sense that, well, this is what people I look up to as people who seem to know what they're doing, and I'm just going along with that. I'm doing that as well. If they're worried, then it probably means I should be worried about it too. And that's a factor that hasn't really been explored with climate anxiety, because the emphasis of, I think it's almost like the research around it has been quite defensive of the possibility that people would say, oh, climate anxiety is some kind of pathological, it's a disorder, we need to just treat it. So I think that's been the focus, but actually there are more questions to ask than that. We also have to think about, what norms are shaping it. So I don't think it's necessarily Greta, but I know that the whole emotional aspect is a very key part of the campaigning for people like that. And I think we need to interrogate that and see, what are people taking away from how we're interpreting those cues. And then the second thing about the geographical difference, I'm going to the geographical difference issue, is that, I can't really say there's a threshold. And this is one of the things that brought me into this research. And it's something that I'm still kind of banging my head against, is because my background, and I would say my core area of research, is with climate change worry. And my framework is risk perception. So when you encounter a risk, it heightens your level of worry. That's the emotional engagement that drives you to do something, engage in mitigating action, that sort of thing, to resolve the risk. That's my day-to-day. But the way I kind of make sense of climate anxiety within that is that we have to also respect the fact that, if you keep ramping up these emotions, like right now, people are aware of the problem. Unless you live under a rock somewhere, you're aware that climate change is happening and you're aware that it's an issue. So you might not necessarily think it's your greatest priority, but you're aware of it. So now if we keep ramping up the emotional engagement, we keep ramping up the concern, right? It will get to a point where the level of anxiety exceeds what people can easily turn into action. As I said, I kind of hinted at this in this idea that climate change is not something that you will just go to one protest and fix it, or buy your electric car or whatever and fix it. It's a long-term campaign. You have to sustain those emotions. You have to sustain that anger, whatever it is that gets you onto the street, for a long time. And that's where the risk of this mental health impacts come in. If you've ever been angry for a really long time, it's exhausting. And so my kind of rationale is basically to say, look, how about we essentially draw from these different areas of research and use it to inform the way we communicate, so that we can simultaneously motivate people to act, but also protect their well-being. So that, I don't have a very clear idea right now what that will look like, but that's where the research, that's the end goal, is to be able to say, okay, now we have enough of an understanding where we can say, when we're designing information campaigns and we're designing an intervention or whatever, we can try to serve these two goals of motivating people and also, supporting their well-being as well. So that's where that needs. So, and then the geographical differences, sorry, yes, that was the thing I was going to, was that I don't think that people, well, I guess the thing about the people in the global south who are not necessarily having the highest levels of concern about climate change, where that comes in is that it goes to that section where I was talking about this idea of the apocalyptic future and things like that. So I've been working on another project in the UK, which is around ethnic minorities' participation in environmental organizations. And I did some interviews, which included speaking to a lady who's a psychotherapist, but who's also involved in climate change. And she's mixed race, so she's from part, I want to say Pakistani and Polish background. And she was saying, look, so I asked her about eco-anxiety, of course. When I found out she's a psychotherapist, I was like, great, you're the kind of person I want to speak with, because I'm more of an academic psychologist. That you actually talk to people who potentially are affected by this stuff. What do they tell you? What's that like? And our one thing she said, which I thought was really good to hear, was that she said, look, the fact is, for a lot of people of color, Black, Indigenous people, climate change is just another layer on top of a whole range of adversities that they're dealing with. So what that means is that, first of all, the experience of eco-anxiety is likely to be different, insofar that people have pre-existing resources, social networks, particular practices and things that they've always drawn on to cope with other adversities like discrimination or a whole variety of things that they've been dealing with. And so when climate change comes, when climate change then gets added to that list of things that they have to deal with, they already have that infrastructure that they can kind of draw on. Whereas if you're a person who's had very different, And then all of a sudden you're awakened to this idea of, climate anxiety is this huge existential crisis. Then one, you don't have those resources to draw on. So it feels like a much bigger challenge. And so potentially that's what's been kind of reflected in those scores. So it's not like people don't care. It's just that understandably, there are other things that they're more concerned about. And I guess we could say the same about, what was saying about the experiences of extreme weather. If you live in, there's such a thing as, I think they're called disaster communities in parts of the US and also in different parts of the world, where communities spring up in areas that are known over and over again. Disasters happen there. So it might be like tornadoes or something that happens, every year your house is going to get blown down and then you rebuild again. It becomes part of your identity. That's just what you do. And if you live in a country that is highly vulnerable to climate change, that's already been affected by climate change, then at a point you reach your ceiling of concern. It's just like, well, we're just adapting, we're just responding to it now. There's no point, and that's that whole worry about what's coming is not a thing for you. You're just living it right now, and that's it. And I think that's also a factor that's worth considering there as well. And then, so to comment on the link between climate anxiety and pro-environmental behavior, I'll just go back very quickly to the tables. You want to see the tables or the graphs? I'm sorry about these tables. I kept trying to think to myself, okay, how can I make this more attractive?
But that is fine. It just needs time to look at. That's all. It's absolutely fine. Yeah, if you could just repeat what you found on pro-environmental behavior and sort of how you interpret it. Just briefly.
So basically, the result of interest. Sorry, one second. Let me just. I'm trying to turn on my pointer. Can't find it. Okay. Anyway, the results of interest are just this line up here. So here we see that climate anxiety has a positive relationship with pro-environmental behavior, and this row at the bottom here is the what's it called, the random slope. So we basically compared. So what we did was we tested two models for each of the outcomes. So in one model, we just had the random intercepts, meaning that, of course, levels of environmental behavior will vary across countries. But then we had another model where we added the fact that the slopes for climate anxiety would vary as well. Now, it so happened that in all of this, the random slope model fit better, so I'm presenting that. And so we see that climate anxiety basically leads to more pro-environmental behavior that's across the board, across the entire sample, whereas it doesn't lead to climate protests. But of course, it's like looking at the main effect and interaction, right? So this main effects in itself doesn't tell you as much as when you then break down the random slopes and see where the difference is. And I think the reason why this isn't significant as a main effect is because it's such a small proportion of countries where you have a positive effect. And then finally, we've got and also, I mean, look at it, the magnitude of the relationship is much bigger in comparison for the relationships in climate anxiety and mental well-being. And then this, hang on, sorry, let me just go back. And then this is just a breakdown of the random slopes. So basically this graph has kind of pushed me to the limits of my R knowledge, which is why you've got numbers at the bottom of the page rather than the country names. I spent quite a while trying to figure out how to do that. So unfortunately, I haven't succeeded yet, but I hope to crack it soon. But it'd be much nicer, of course, if you actually had the country label so you can see what's what. But I kind of have it memorized pretty much by now. So the first 4 countries, that's Australia, Brazil, Canada, and Chile, where we have significant positive effects of climate anxiety and pro-environmental behavior. And then the 5th country is China. We don't have an effect there. And then after China is I want to say Finland and Germany are these 2 where you have this positive effect. And then you've got I think that's India, and then you've got Indonesia. And anyway, so in terms of the distribution for the PEB, for the pro-environmental behavior, it doesn't seem to align quite as neatly with the whole Western and non-Western or global North, global South divide. So we have countries here that are not, that are in the global South, where we still have this positive effect.
I wonder if there are like two interacting two influencing potentially factors that is the information that we have and the whole sort of array of pro-environmental culture sort of related things on the one hand, and on the other is still a direct experience of, you know, and basically a very sort of very lived reality of what climate change is, where anxiety is actually probably activated because, you know, there is no protection and well, in response to your question about the lived reality of it, we did explore this. So we had one of the first models that we tested, we included the climate risk index, which was generated by German Watch as a level 2 predictor. So this is a national level indicator of how much damage basically has been suffered in each country as a result of natural disasters and climatic events and things like that. And that was not a significant predictor. So that's why we left that out. But there is definitely something there to unpack at the country level. I think, well, part of the reason why I haven't really gone into it personally myself is that I feel that the sample size we have is a bit small. If we had a slightly larger sample, then the estimates at level 2 would be more reliable. Right now, it's not very much. So I haven't really done too much at that level, but certainly there are a lot of really interesting questions to be asking at that level as well. Yeah, thank you. Okay, maybe, you know, there are lots of people in the audience, which I'm sure would like to also comment and ask questions. So please unmute yourself and speak.
Yeah, thank you very much for your fascinating talk. It was really great, and I was about to I want to put like for each slide that you have. It was really, really interesting for me and really comprehensive as well. So it was really great. Thank you. And I'm sorry, I'm in the cafeteria because I have a really bad internet connection at home.
Okay.
So maybe a bit noisy, but my question is that you check the engagement in protest actions and well-being, and what's the relationship between them? Because hypothetically, maybe I think if you can protest, you feel okay, I did the action and I can express myself, maybe I will blame myself less, for example, or something, so it would increase my well-being, or just what do you think about it, and did you explore it?
Oh, no, well, both of the so both protesting and just general pro-environmental behaviors are positively related to well-being. And I mean, there's lots of evidence that's established that already outside of this study anyway. But I guess the point we're trying to make here is that often that then gets thrown out quite indiscriminately as, oh, well, if you're feeling down about climate change, if you're feeling anxious, just go and engage in some pro-environmental behaviors, get out there and protest. And there isn't enough attention given to the fact that not everyone can do that. So I guess that's the main thing we're trying to draw out here. But indeed, yes, for people who can, it's good for your well-being.
That's really interesting. I'm also working in the field of extreme weather condition and how it's influenced psychological adaptation and mitigation actions. I will do it in my PhD. So I think I will text you.
Fantastic. Yeah, do get in touch. Yeah, that is an area that's very close to my mind. It's one of the areas I put most of my efforts into, is the whole extreme weather thing. And it's because I guess I first came into it because I thought, you know, there's all this political polarization and all this stuff. And it's like, you can't argue with stuff that you've seen for yourself. You can't argue with stuff you experienced yourself. You don't need anyone to interpret a flood to you. It's bad. You know, so that's really appealing. But somehow, just the way humans are, it's never that straightforward, is it? There's always some kind of narrative, and people, you know, a whole bunch of people can experience the exact same thing and go away with very different interpretations. So it's a very interesting topic. I can't see the chat, so I don't know if people are popping.
No, so far no questions in the
Okay.
chat, but maybe anyone else would like to unmute yourself and ask questions. And it's good if you introduce yourself as well, maybe. So Sasha Noah was from our research group, actually.
Yeah.
Hi there, Charles. It's Mike. I think you know me.
Hi, Mike. Yes.
Forgive me, I'm not going to put my camera on. I'm a bit under the weather today. I'm not very presentable.
That's
okay. A fascinating talk as ever. I really enjoyed it. Just more about kind of a general question on your opinions, really.
Yeah.
Obviously, you allude to the fact that there's utility in a level of climate concern. And obviously, then there's certain parties who seek to increase that within the population.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you had any thoughts on where responsibility lies of then addressing with the potential consequences in terms of climate anxiety, which could obviously be harmful and in some cases unhelpful. So I wondered if you had an opinion on that.
Thanks. That's a really good question. I absolutely believe that the responsibility lies with communicators. I think that there are ways to be irresponsible in communicating. We see it all the time in like political communication, and certainly with climate change, we need to do better than that. So it's not enough to just be like, I want to put out this information to get people worked up. You've got to kind of think through the entire process and think, not everyone is going to be in the same exact circumstance, what kinds of things, in the same way when we plan an event, we think about health and safety, we think about all that stuff. Similarly, when we're planning to communicate with the public around climate change, we need to kind of think through, what sorts of impacts that they might that information we're putting out might have beyond just, sort of motivating people to act. When people put out information, for example, that's designed to elicit outrage about, I don't know, the government failing to do, pass a policy or legislation or something that will have a positive impact in terms of resolving climate change, we also need to think, well, there will be some people out there who will see that information and it will just be the thing that sends them over. And it's just like, I give up on this. This is not, and we need to essentially have an ethic of care in communicating around climate change. And that's kind of my position on it, I think.
No, I think that's great. That's one of the things I've got to tell you a compliment that I really like about your work is that you're not overly idealistic or what's the word I would use? Yeah, apologies, I'm a bit under the weather. But you're very pragmatic in that, and you recognise that you're not overly say quote unquote virtue signaling. You recognise that in signaling these issues, the responsibility that lies with that. So I appreciate the pragmatic approach.
Thanks, Mike. I should point out that Mike is also one of my collaborators. I noticed, I think Navjot was here as well. So it's really good to kind of see people from the team on here too.
Yeah, it's very nice to have some international audience attending. So keep an eye on our seminar series as well. There's some more talks coming up. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Please don't be shy. As long as we have Charles for a few minutes with us.
Please, fire away.
I'd like to ask a question too. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really interesting. Really a lot to unpack and interesting comparison between countries. So I paid attention to the section where you talked about how experience of extreme weather events did not have any impact on climate anxiety. So I don't know, this is, I guess, not a question, but maybe just a point for discussion. It brought me to a thought about other side of climate impact that is not really extreme, but that has kind of very devastating consequences for people, such as deforestation or desertification or the lack of water or resources. So people in some countries do not experience extreme events, but they experience these slow events that really impact their lives. For example, like I come from a Central Asian country, and in this area, we have water issues that are becoming more and more like, I don't know, visible for us, like slowly through time. and people are experiencing more worry about this thing. So what might be your, maybe you have done a research on that, or maybe you have some consideration on that side?
Thanks. That's a really good question. I've got one paper I can direct you to, but other people have done. I mean, this is starting to grow into, and there's a paper we published in or called on attribution of extreme weather events, was a couple of years ago now. And as I said, I'm very excited. I was, and I still am very excited about experience of extreme weather events and the potential it has to mobilize people to act on climate change. But I think we underestimate the heterogeneity of narratives around this event. The fact that you make the connection, you and I, we make the connection that, oh, there's that desertification, or there's the whatever that's linked to climate change, doesn't mean other people will make the connection. Climate change is not the only narrative in town. There are a whole variety of other ways people can make sense of it totally without ever thinking about climate change. And I think that's the key part of experience. It's almost like, and this seems kind of trivial, but I was reading something recently that I thought was so relevant to this. Back in, I don't know, 1600s or whatever, people in the UK who were people of means would travel around Europe to experience what was going on. And they would have guides that essentially would tell them how to enjoy the landscape that they were seeing. And I was thinking, this is so relevant to the issue of things like extreme weather. It's almost like you have to kind of give people a script to make sense of what they're seeing. The climate change is so different from all the other stuff that what's it called, the knowledge frameworks with which we were making sense of the world before, and now climate change has come and kind of disrupted all that. But not everybody has quite gotten up to date on what climate change means and how it manifests itself and all that kind of thing. So I think, obviously, in this situation, when we asked about flooding and things like that, we didn't ask them, well, did you think that flood you experienced was linked to climate change? I think if we did, we might have slightly different results, because if you experience a flood and you don't think it has anything to do with climate change, maybe you think, oh, the government didn't maintain that dam, or they didn't do whatever, that's what's caused the flood, then why would your concern about climate change increase or change in any way?
Yes, thank you. That also might be part of the reason why people do not really feel climate change anxiety, because they might so
they're experiencing it, they're vulnerable, they're living in countries that definitely affected, but it's just not there in the consciousness. It's just not.
Any more questions? Okay, from those who already asked, or any new questions, any new people? Okay, well.
Oh, of course, I'm Russian and I'm interested in which sample did you have, because Russia is so huge and we're always interested. Like I understand that in Moscow and St. Petersburg, where we also have most of our data in our research, that the people may be much concerned than they are in different regions, but also we have regions where we have ecological problems and they influence the concern significantly. We also had this research. Okay. So just if you can elaborate on it.
My collaborator is at Cuban State University. Now I don't know if that's the correct way to pronounce. Is it Cuban? Or
Cuban.
So that's where we gathered the data. But I'll be interested. I mean, that's the thing about places like Russia as well, and I guess that's why the US as well is so fascinating, because it's so big. You can have so many different pockets of people with different perspectives and ideas about these issues and things like that. So that'll be really interesting to kind of look into that as well. Now, I don't really know the details, but I'm sure I read shortly after we concluded this project that there was some kind of change to the law, which means that it's more difficult to collect data in Russia or something like that. I don't know. I haven't tried since then.
We haven't heard anything like that.
Oh, right. Okay, maybe
not really. No.
In Belarus, I guess it's a huge problem right now, but in Russia, it's still okay.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, if we have follow-up projects, I'll be sure to let you guys know if you're interested.
Do get in touch with us. Yes, indeed. I think it would be always interesting, to compare. We do something with CAST now as well.
Oh, right. Okay, nice.
Yeah, something related to climate change and COVID project.
Oh, right. Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool research coming out of CAST actually around issues like that. Yeah.
So yeah, well, I'm going to stop the recording here probably.